Wait just another minute. We'll wait another minute for folks to join. Hello, if you're just joining us, we're going to be waiting about another minute for everybody to join us. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Lee Evans. My pronouns are they or she. I am with the organization This Is What We Did and part of the JEDI working group for Stop the Money Pipeline. I'm so glad to be here today with all of you, with our fantastic speakers, and with our wonderful team who put on this workshop. So this is a smaller team within the working group made up of Akiksha Chatterjee, Ariel Smirnoff, Arunima Sen, Karina Williams, and myself. And this is part 5 of a workshop series that hopefully you all have been part of for many months now. And next slide, please, Karina. So these are the other parts of the workshop that were in this 5-part series called Broadening Our Ideas of Climate Justice. The first one happened on August 8th, and it was on sacrifice zones in the era of electrification. The second was on September 12th, and that was on migrant and climate justice. The third was on October 10th, and that was on climate justice and the prison industrial complex. And the fourth was on November 14th on labor and climate justice. And given the events happening specifically in Israel-Palestine and around the world right now, we felt the need to also add a 5th workshop called Militarism and Climate Justice, which is what you're in right now. So you will be receiving at the end of today's workshop a survey specifically for this workshop, but then also in the near future, we will be sending out a survey to look at the entirety of the series and to get your feedback about that as well. So I would love to go to the next slide now. Thank you, Karina. We are going to open with an acknowledgement that we all reside on stolen and unceded lands of Indigenous peoples. I am residing on the land stewarded by many tribes who for thousands of years made their homes along the Columbia River in so-called Portland, Oregon. These tribes include the Cowlitz, Clackamas, Multnomah, Wasco, Cathlamet, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molale, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and many others. We ask that you all take a moment, if you don't already know this information about the land you're on, to look it up using this tool, which Karina just put in the chat. And once you know, please go ahead and share that in the chat. And if you already know it, wonderful. Please go ahead and share that. So you'll notice that this tool also encourages you to verify the information that it presents. So please do further research on your own time. I see some coming in. We also acknowledge that the genocide and displacement and racism and violence against Indigenous people that has been ongoing for hundreds of years continues to this day, and that true justice, including climate justice, centers their stories, knowledge, and agency. Thank you all for taking a moment to explore that. We can go to the next slide, Karina. Thank you. So without a doubt, there are many of us here today who are directly impacted by ongoing wars, violent military repressions, and genocides of which there are tragically many happening around the world. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the suffering and destruction faced by all those who have been and currently are directly impacted by this violence. Oppressed peoples, creatures of all kinds, forests, rivers, oceans, entire ecosystems. So thank you for taking a moment to acknowledge that with me. And I would also like to take a moment to envision a world beyond military violence, beyond an economic system that props up and profits from military violence at the cost of addressing the climate crisis and choosing life. May we collectively move towards choosing life with greater dedication, collaboration, and openness to possibility. So thank you all for being here today and for your sensitivity to the impacts that too many are currently enduring. And we ask that you commit here to listening, learning, and staying open to the ways that this military violence impacts specific people and also in many ways all of us. And with that, let us move on to some logistics for today and introducing our fantastic group of speakers who will be educating us on these interrelated topics. Next slide, please, Karina. So first, we're going to do some logistics and overview, and then I will pass it to one of our wonderful speakers to do a topic overview. And then we will have the other 3 speaker presentations. Then we'll do a Q&A, and then we will close. Next slide, Karina. So the chat will be closed for the remainder of the workshop, but if you have questions throughout the workshop, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A box. And so this is a separate button on your Zoom panel. And I'm also making sure that the captions are on. And so if you need those, they are also in your Zoom toolbar. With regard to the Q&A, please keep questions respectful. If you are disrespectful, you may be removed from the webinar or your question may be removed from the Q&A. And in terms of recording, don't worry, we will record this workshop, so it will be sent to you afterwards along with all of the resources, and that will be sent in the next few days. And next slide, please, Karina. So just a quick reminder about who we are. Who is STOMP? Stop the Money Pipeline, also known as STOMP, is a coalition of over 200 organizations. We are working to stop the financial industry from financing the climate crisis, environmental racism, and violations of Indigenous rights. And that's who you're part of. So next slide, please, Karina. Now I get to have the honor of introducing our wonderful speakers for tonight in order of when they will be speaking. Our first speaker, Batul Hassan, is with the Climate and Community Project. She is the policy manager at Climate and Community Project, where she focuses on health, care, and education research that supports transformative climate policy that benefits the multiracial working class and meets the climate crisis at scale. She has a background in public health, migration, and labor organizing. Our next speaker will be Dr. Patrick Bigger, who is the research director at the Climate and Community Project. His eclectic research interests span a variety of climate justice issues, from global South debt justice to US public land policy to the role of the US military in the climate crisis. His most recent research quantifies the climate impacts of Israel's invasion of Gaza. And then after Dr. Patrick Bigger, we will have Angel Parker. Angel Parker is an organizer located on stolen Lenape and Canarsie lands, known widely as New York City. Though based in NYC, Angel proudly hails from Detroit, Michigan, which informs her analysis on centering the needs and self-determination of Black working-class communities. She was introduced to organizing through participating in direct actions in the aftermath of the killings of Eric Garner, Mike Brown, and Rekia Boyd. Angel worked in various settings to effect change in the criminal legal system before finding a political home through grassroots organizing in Survived and Punished NY. Through Dissenters, Angel coaches student organizers to build anti-militarist and abolitionist campaigns on campus. And our final speaker will be Tara Hauska. of the Couchiching First Nation Anishinaabe. And Tara is a tribal attorney, founder of the Ginu Collective, and a former advisor on Native American affairs to Bernie Sanders. She spent 6 months on the front lines fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline and is currently engaged in the movement to defund fossil fuels and a years-long struggle against Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline. She is a co-founder of Not Your Mascots, a group committed to positive representation of Native peoples. She's a TED speaker, the 2017 Harvard Public Interested Keynote, received an Awesome Women Award from Melinda Gates and a 2019 Rachel's Network Catalyst Award, is featured in Women, A Century of Change by National Geographic, and was named an icon on the cover of Outside Magazine's 40th anniversary edition. Tara has contributed to the women-led climate anthology All We Can Save, the New York Times, The Guardian, Vogue, Indian Country Today, and been featured on CNN, MSNBC, CBS, Democracy Now!, and BBC. So we have quite the list of speakers for you all today. I'm so excited to now pass it off to our first speaker, Batul. So take it away, Batul.
Thanks, Lee. Sorry, I have some background noise. But hi, everybody. My name is Batul. I'll be moderating tonight, and I'm also going to start by giving a little bit more context for this panel now. So the connections between the climate justice, anti-war, anti-military, anti-colonial movements really can't be overstated, and I'm so grateful to the organizers for pulling this event together and to all of you who are here tonight to kind of collectively think through the military-industrial complex's larger role in what's happening right now in the world, particularly as it relates to our struggle for climate justice and, our fight for a fully decarbonized, livable world where all people and ecosystems can thrive. I'm sure many of us already come to the climate movement with this general understanding that the climate crisis is also a crisis of global imperialism. As we know, and we've heard so many times, the global South is most impacted by climate chaos, even as countries like this one and the global North have contributed historically to its drivers the most. And this imbalance continues through historic and ongoing patterns of colonization, settler colonialism, and resource extraction and use, even in the supply chains for decarbonization that we so urgently need to happen, but also perhaps should be planned to ensure we're not repeating and doubling down on mistakes of the past. And I think as a movement, we generally have a very clear, sharp understanding of the status of the oil, gas, and other extractive industries. We see them as clear climate enemies, but somehow, sometimes, the military-industrial complex gets left out of our shared analyses of the systems at play and the systems that we're struggling against and within. Even as we acknowledge that so much of our status quo needs to be radically transformed in our fight for a healthy, safe, and livable world. And, as was already mentioned, the need for these conversations to be had has become really horrifyingly clear in the last 3 months as we witness the ongoing genocide in Gaza and our own government's complicity. Where I work at Climate and Community Project, we've been working recently to pull some of these connections together between climate justice work, Palestine solidarity, and demilitarization, to make it as clear as possible, because the levels of death and destruction that we're seeing right now, it's not just horrifying, it's actively harmful to the work that we're trying to do. So with that in mind, I'll give us a little bit of grounding. I know that other panelists will get into different aspects of militarism and climate justice, but I do think it's important that we start this conversation with an acknowledgement of the ongoing horrors in Gaza. So Gaza, of course, has been in crisis for, the past 16 years of Israeli blockade and decades more of occupation. But since the October 7th attacks, Israel has been running a really unrestrained campaign of collective punishment against Palestinians in a small area of land that's been described for decades as the largest open-air prison in the world. The most recent estimates that I've found, more than 25,000 Palestinians have been killed, 10,000 of whom were children. That's more children than have been killed in any conflict in modern times. At least 50,000 Palestinians have been seriously injured, And that's a very difficult kind of number to estimate because nearly all of the medical infrastructure, including dozens of hospitals in Gaza, has been destroyed, and thousands of people remain unaccounted for. Nearly 90% of Gaza's residents are displaced to the south of the Gaza Strip, with where hundreds of thousands of people are sheltering in tents. The UN has said that, so these people are starving. Insufficient humanitarian aid is able to reach them because of fighting and because of Israeli restrictions. And just as a quick kind of snapshot of like what these statistics show us, we know that in the first 6 weeks of Israel's bombing, Israel dropped roughly one bomb per 100 people living in Gaza, and that was just in a month and a half period. And we know that all of this material that goes into these bombs originally comes from the earth. Uranium, other metals and minerals are firstly mined, which is already a destructive process, of course, that should be minimized, but then they're repackaged and manufactured into weapons, which are deployed during, war to not only destroy people and people's lives, but also the health and stability of ecosystems. Um, and we know historically that beyond the immediate deaths and injuries from this sustained campaign, there are going to be long-term health impacts to both people and environment that we need to be thinking about now too. So we've all been seeing rubble-filled photos that show how toxic dust and ash are settling over people, the people who remain in Gaza, and this is a major public health crisis. So just for a quick comparison, after the US bombing of Fallujah in 2004, leukemia rates in the area increased by 2,200%. Childhood cancers increased by 1,260%, and brain tumors went up by 740% just within 5 to 10 years. In Basra, another city in Iraq, patients showed up with cancers in multiple organs. And the US in those campaigns was using just a fraction, really, of the munitions that Israel has been using in its campaign since October 7th. And of course, we see damage to the earth too, from destruction of water systems to destruction of native plants and trees, uprooting indigenous plants, damage to the soil, not to mention the, Palestine's inability to adapt to, new climate crises due to its the ongoing Israeli apartheid. And then through all of this, which is maybe what makes this such a critical conversation for us to be having, is that we're seeing really newly emboldened reactionary leadership in the US who are pushing to send even more money to aid this assault, which is taking money away from much needed services and programs in this country. So we've already seen gestures towards defunding the Inflation Reduction Act to cover these increases in military spending. So the Inflation Reduction Act, as flawed and insufficient as it may be, it's still the biggest climate spending bill that the US has seen to date. President Biden himself has bypassed Congress multiple times now to approve sending more weapons to the Israeli military. And earlier this month, as a reaction to the Houthi blockade of ships going to Israel for the ceasefire demand, instead of taking kind of the obvious de-escalatory option of calling for an immediate ceasefire, the US and its global allies have now started bombing Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world, without congressional approval and at the risk of inciting further regional war. And this is in addition to ongoing Israeli airstrikes in 3 other countries, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. So I think with all of these actions, it's become clear that for, the establishment, maintaining flows of global capital, maintaining our status quo, keeping international shipping routes running on time is more important than Palestinian lives. And I think that this logic is very familiar to a lot of us, a logic that values the continuation of capitalism and imperialism over and at the cost of the flourishing of people and planet together. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's also particularly important for us to be having these conversations as people who live in the United States, because the military funding and the policy decisions that are made in this country, which of course has its own history in continuation of settler colonialism, These decisions are made at the expense of investment in a climate-safe future. They also facilitate violence at home, from overinvestment in policing and mass incarceration, to the militarization of our border walls and immigration systems and more. So we can really see right now that even as the climate crisis is intensifying, this kind of state of perpetual war and conflict is not an accident, and it is driven by the US establishment's insistence on maintaining these systems. From Israel to like our own neighborhoods, all of this is happening at the expense of working people, and it's used to justify, the US military's continued domination of what we're able to do in the world, like our public resources and our capacity as a society. Together, this is fueling the climate crisis, of course. It's also really a huge challenge to decarbonization, let alone decarbonization that achieves climate justice, which, I think we would see as a process that confronts also not only decarbonization, but kind of confronting the many different oppressions that exist in the world. So I hope that's a short introduction that's a little bit grounding. With that, I'm going to pass it off to my coworker, Patrick Bigger, who is the research director at Climate and Community Project and has been doing a lot of great work on this topic. And as mentioned earlier, please drop your questions in the Q&A box and we'll circle back to those towards the end. Thanks. Go ahead, Patrick.
Great. Thank you so much, Batul, and thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to share some of this with you this evening. Like Batul said, my name is Patrick. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the research director at the Climate and Community Project, and I'm based in Frederick, Maryland. And I want to Batul already did a fantastic job of setting the scene and some of the stakes of what we're discussing this evening. And I want to provide a little bit of data and context around some of those observations. I'd also like to shout out Batul, who led a report that we published in November. It's the front page of our website right now, called Ceasefire Now, Ceasefire Forever, on the climate justice dimensions of the genocide that's happening right now in Gaza, and why climate justice activists must be on board and working towards Palestinian liberation. So I want to shout Batul out and flag that, as well as a couple of other recent publications that I've been lucky to be a part of around this question of the military-industrial complex, the climate crisis, and Palestine. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, who include Kim Rogaley, Nick Pierce, Kediki Zajkar, Ben Nymark, Frederick Larby, and Ruben Larby, who are all indispensable collaborators on these projects. So my comments are based on two recent publications. The first is a collaboration with Commonwealth in the UK on the climate costs of US and UK military operations since 2015. And the second is a working paper published with academic colleagues in the UK on the climate dimensions of the genocide in Gaza. The premise of each piece is pretty straightforward, and I think they'll be linked in the chat. In Less War and Less Warming, we looked at the self-reported military emissions from both the US and UK since 2015, and then applied a middle-of-the-road social cost of carbon to those emissions. And combined, we find those emissions, if we were to cost them this way, at $111 billion between 2015 and 2022, and $106 billion is the US's shares of that. And that figure is a conservative estimate, since each military failed to report emissions at least 1 year during that period. Each military's carbon accounting leaves a lot to be desired, and we easily could have picked a much higher social cost of carbon. Nonetheless, this figure gives us an indication of the climate costs of running world-spanning military operations, while demonstrating the severe discrepancy between each country's spending on climate action, as well as the even more severe disconnect between each country's paltry contributions to international climate finance relative to both military spending and their cumulative contributions to aggregate emissions. The second piece is an even more recent collaboration that we did over our holiday break, trying to figure out some of the climate consequences of Israel's invasion of Gaza. We looked at the emissions of some of the warfighting activities during the first 60 days of war, as well as the embedded emissions of both the Gaza tunnel system and the Israeli so-called smart wall around Gaza, and then finally created a fairly low resolution projection of the carbon costs of rebuilding Gaza back to its previous state. However insufficient that condition is to promote human flourishing, much less to cope with the physical impacts of climate change. So in this talk, I'll mostly focus on the US military-industrial complex as a world historical climate villain before zooming in on Israeli action in Palestine and particularly the US's role in it, and then conclude with some policy directions to consider. The US military is the largest consumer of liquid fossil fuels in the world and has been for quite some time. And not only is the US the largest military spender and largest consumer of liquid fuels, it's also the most emissions intensive military in the world. During World War II, the average US soldier consumed about a gallon of oil a day. And now that figure is north of 20, or results in 42 metric tons per soldier per year, which is just an astonishing figure. And those emissions stack up. The military constitutes about 80% of all US federal government emissions. And while the UK's military spending and emissions are an order of magnitude lower than those of the US, we do have better data on the carbon intensity of the UK arms industry, which provides us a clearer picture of the climate harms produced by the wider military-industrial complex, in addition to the acute suffering they produce when those weapons are, for example, gifted to Israel to massacre Palestinian civilians. And so we can see in this graph on the right, drawing on work by Nita Crawford at Brown University, the US military alone emits CO2 than many nations. I think that if the US military was its own country, it would be in the 40s in the kind of global league table of emissions. And one of the key things to remember when we're thinking about US military emissions is that even though emissions certainly rise during large-scale operations, the everyday operations form the bulk of the US military's emissions. And there's two key dimensions of this. The first is the sprawling network of bases that the US and to a lesser extent the UK operates around the world, just somewhere around 850 combined, but nobody actually knows the exact figure of how many overseas outposts the US military maintains. We draw from an academic named David Vine's work on base world is what he calls it for this figure. In fact, the Pentagon's own tracking of its own facilities is so bad that the RAND Corporation has to use external estimates of the number of bases because the military just doesn't disclose all the places that troops are deployed at any given time. And keeping all of these imperial outposts staffed and provisioned creates massive, sprawling logistical networks for materiel, food, construction materials, and above all, fossil fuels. As General David Petraeus said in 2011, energy is the lifeblood of our war-fighting capabilities, and I would add just the quotidian day-to-day operations of global empire. And then the other major dimension here is the energetic requirement of the major weapon systems that these militaries operate. Tanks, ships, and above all, jets are prodigious consumers of oil, and that intensity is actually rising. And you can see in this figure on the right that was based on some research that I'd previously done, that the Air Force is by far the biggest emitter, which makes sense given the carbon intensity of keeping these planes in the air on sundry bombing missions, but just on training missions on an everyday basis has massive climate consequences. In terms of those airborne emissions, for example, the F-35, which is also being used by Israel to fly patrol flights over Gaza right now, the F-35 consumes almost 40% more fuel than the F-16 that it largely replaces. The F-16 is also the airframe that's being used on most bombing raids over Gaza. But given the staggering $1.75 trillion cost of the F-35 program, it's unlikely that these jets will be taken out of service anytime soon, which is a really key example of how these weapon systems lock in fossil fuel use, well past any projection of net zero or, thinking about pie in the sky ideas like sustainable aviation fuel. These are going to be massive contributors to the climate crisis for this foreseeable future unless there's a big step change in how the US considers its security policy. And the F-35 is also a great example of the political economy of how military hardware functions. Components are sourced from every state and from a number of allied countries, including, as you'll see at the bottom, Israel, which creates a hugely powerful constituency for keeping military spending high. It's the modern exemplar of what think of as military Keynesianism, or the form of industrial policy that the US has followed since World War II that privileges defense spending, production, and contracting above just about any other public policy goal. Beyond these more recent and ongoing emissions, it's also worth considering the role of particularly the US military in the creation of the global fossil fuel economy. The transition from coal to oil by the US and UK navies at the turn of the 20th century instantly spawned massive guaranteed demand for oil, and each country's foreign policy shifted to meet that demand. From the UK mandate system in West Asia, including Palestine, that secured oil interests for the UK and US companies, to the construction of bases and refueling stations throughout the Indian and Pacific Oceans, each military has played a significant role in the creation and protection of the global oil industry. And if you just compare the map of global shipping routes with our map of base world, and we see this corridor of bases running through West Asia, it's hard not to connect those particular dots. It's also worth noting that bases and operations around the world, in addition to the carbon costs they incur through provisioning and maintaining them, these bases also have acute environmental impacts beyond the diffuse emissions of greenhouse gases. From forever chemicals and firefighting foams at bases around the world, to toxic burn pits in Afghanistan, to toxic waste in one of the US's modern colonies in Puerto Rico, and other modern colonies, Hawaii, others in the Pacific. The everyday operations of the US military is harming communities around the world that live adjacent to bases. And that's without getting into the social and economic harms that often accompany overseas military bases, including sexual violence or the loss of sovereignty for countries that cede territory to the US to build and maintain bases. To zoom in on the US military industrial complex and Israel a bit, understanding the climate dimensions of all of this military production, we know that the US is the primary exporter of arms to Israel, including potentially lethal, well, not definitely lethal, and potentially illegal munitions like white phosphorus that Israel has used in Lebanon. And then this idea that the US is providing somehow precision weapons, which seems to me to be an effectively meaningless phrase. But this is a long-standing relationship of arming a state that has been actively repressing, dispossessing, and killing civilians in Palestine for decades. But even in light of that, US aid commitments to Israel have continued to increase from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s and so on. Now we're seeing, even in non-conflict times, $3.7 billion worth of military aid flowing from the US to Israel annually. And that is a major benefit to US arms manufacturers. So you can see in this graph on the left, the US is the world's top arms exporting country globally. And then that pie chart in the center shows you that the exporters of major conventional weapon systems to Israel from 2011 to 2020, the US comprises more than 70% of that. And war famously is big business, and it's very good business for the US military industrial complex. If you'll see that dip followed by the large rise in Lockheed Martin's share price, that's October 7th. So even at the outset of when it became clear that Israel was going to retaliate in Gaza, this represented a major inflow of cash to weapons producers. And that's now extending to the Israeli military tech industry that American angel investors or venture capital are pouring money into. And finally, to pivot briefly to the climate costs of the genocide happening in Gaza, these are figures from the Guardian write-up of the research that we did. And we can see that in the first 60 days of the war, well, the first thing to note about this is this tiny sliver of emissions caused by Hamas rockets, whereas the vast majority of emissions so far have been incurred by basically air transport and bombing missions conducted by Israel and the US. And this is definitely not the most important reason to continue to demand a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. It's probably not even the second or third or fourth most important reason. Every single human life that is in danger is a good reason to demand a ceasefire now. But it's instructive for a number of reasons, including understanding the long-term impacts of war, the US role in the invasion, and a further demonstration of that fundamental asymmetry between Gaza and Israel. So you can see that the emissions just in the first 60 days of the war were bigger than those of 20 small, very climate vulnerable countries. But if we take a step back and look at the emissions implied by needing to rebuild Gaza, even to its previous precarious state, is equivalent to the annual emissions from New Zealand. So what do we do about it? First of all, this is a project that we're going to be undertaking probably for the next couple of years on a just transition in the US military industrial complex. And it all hinges on what we think of as a reparative strategy that is both reparations for past harms, but also thinking about ways of making different kinds of worlds possible. So that involves, of course, an immediate ceasefire and end to military aid to Israel, an immediate and massive scale of assistance to Palestine to rebuild resiliently. Not just less pollution, but less military, as we saw in the carbon lock-in from the F-35. It's critical that money be diverted from the military towards other priorities, which I'm sure you can all think of a million better ways to spend money than on continuing to destroy people on the planet through the military-industrial complex. It must be base closure, payments to countries for past and present pollution incurred by US military operations, a global military superfund to clean up those acute environmental impacts, more transparent military pollution data. The US was at the forefront of blocking the reporting of military emissions in Kyoto in '92, and again with the military carve-out in Paris in 2015. And then finally, a just transition for arms workers and military personnel to better, more meaningful, less destructive employment that actually helps us fight the climate crisis rather than exacerbate it. There are priors on some of these ideas, particularly in the UK, around Lucas plans, where arms manufacturing workers organized to transition away from building the weapons of war to building socially useful things, interestingly, including heat pumps all the way back in the 70s. So that is certainly something that we have precedent for. And finally, repurposing US military manufacturing capacity. In the early 90s, during a rare downturn in military funding, Lockheed Martin actually developed a series of electrified and hybrid buses. So these skills are transferable. These manufacturing facilities are often easy or relatively easy to retrofit, and we should be pushing to make that a reality. And I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Patrick. That was great. Reminder to put questions in the question box, and Angel, you can go ahead and get started.
Thank you. What's up, y'all? My name is Angel. Oh, sorry, I think I accidentally. My name's Angel. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a field organizer with Dissenters. Dissenters is a Black and Indigenous youth-led organization. We are specifically hoping to both usher in, but also be a part of this kind of new era of the anti-war movement with those directly impacted, with folks of color at the forefront. So we are situated primarily in universities and colleges, as well as a number of major cities across Turtle Island and the occupied lands of Hawaii and Guam. And we run several campaigns across chapters. So these campaigns include Cops Off Campus, ROTC Off Campus, and our most popular is our Divest from Death campaign, which is a divestment campaign aimed at weapons manufacturers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about militarism as it relates to Palestine. But we do, just as a note, we do work around anti-war generally. So can I get the next slide? Okay, so what is militarism, right? So we kind of at Dissenters, we define militarism as what you see here on the screen. So the belief that of a government that a country should maintain a strong military capacity and be prepared to use it aggressively to defend quote unquote national interests, right? So what does this look like? Next slide, please. The US spends 35% of the world's total military spending. And we just heard Dr. Patrick talk a bit about this. In 2017, that was $610 billion alone. Next slide. 48% of the federal budget, right, went to military spending. And this is increasing, right? A lot of us know the Pentagon and the Department of Defense budget is always increasing. Next slide. And so the total cost of wars, right, since 2001 is a whopping $4.93 trillion, right? And 2001 is actually around the time a lot of our chapter members were born, right? A lot of them are Gen Z and they were born around like 2003. So this is the world that they were born into. And this is the country kind of that they were born into. Next slide. So 66% of US voters support a ceasefire, yet only 3% of Congress has signed on to a resolution calling for a ceasefire, right? And these numbers are from around last November. So ideally, right, this would be an even bigger number. So why is this, right? Why is it that the majority of the population, the majority of these folks' constituencies support a permanent ceasefire, yet these people are not accountable at all, not even listening, right? Folks have been calling into their local officials' offices nonstop since October, and a lot of folks are going straight to voicemail, if not the phones are cut off. Why is this? Because of these companies, right? Boeing, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Elbit, right? This is what we call the US weapons industry or weapons manufacturers. And these are the folks that we mainly target in our divest campaigns. So next slide, please. These, right? This is a shot from 2019. If folks remember when Donald Trump was president and brought us pretty much to the edge of war with Iran. These are the companies whose stocks like shot up. Again, and Dr. Patrick was just talking about this. So next slide. Just to give you an idea, right? These are the 5 major companies that we kind of focus on at Dissenters. And when it comes to militarism, when it comes to like the climate footprint of the US military, which we know, right, that Israel cannot continue what it's doing without the US military, these companies are on center stage, right? These are companies and people within these companies that make billions with a big B of dollars off genocide and off destruction. So when you hear like the term military aid, like the US government's giving military aid to Israel or the US is giving military aid to this country or that country, what that means is that the US is giving out government contracts to these companies. So they are literally giving our tax dollars that they force us to pay, and they give it to these people to fund wars. So just to give you an idea of how, and again, I'm like so glad that I'm going after Dr. Patrick because he did like such a great job of kind of laying the groundwork. After October 7th, right, a lot of the leadership of these companies were on record talking about what was to be expected. So for example, let's take Raytheon, which goes by RTX, but we call them colloquial Raytheon. Just weeks, right, after October 7th, the CEO of Raytheon told investors at one of their like earnings reportings that they were going to see an increased benefit of the restocking of missiles. Raytheon makes the missiles that are used in Israel's infamous Iron Dome, right? On that call, there was an analyst from Morgan Stanley, another Wall Street firm that I think folks are pretty familiar with. So when the CEO of Raytheon talked about this big benefit of missile restockings, this Morgan Stanley analyst replied that the war against Palestine appeared to be, quote, an opportunity that fits quite nicely with the company's offerings. Just to give you an idea of how these people view war, right? Similarly, in October, just a few mere weeks after October 7th, the vice president at General Dynamics told investors, right, that in terms of the war on Palestine, that if you look at the incremental demand potential, the biggest one to highlight, the one that really sticks out, is probably on the artillery side, right? That's where they're going to make their bread. So General Dynamics, they supply personnel carriers, ammunition, warships, and submarines to Israel and also to repressive militaries across the world. Lockheed Martin, to give you another example, Lockheed Martin is expected to see a huge purchase for their F-35 strike fighter jets that we were just talking about, right? That Israel has, again, infamously used to subjugate Palestinians. So, and just to point out, just because I can never leave Boeing out of the mix, right? Boeing is in a like little PR crisis right now because it turned out that they knew that their planes that have been, I don't know if y'all folks saw what happened on the Alaska Airlines flight. It turns out that they knew that their planes were not safe, right? And they knew that this could possibly happen, and they covered it up and also retaliated against employees that told them about it. So those of us at Decentrism, we're always joking that like Boeing is allowed to, right, have these like shitty commercial flights because that's their side gig. Their main bag is actually like war crimes and supplying repressive militaries with weapons, right? That's why they're allowed to do these things, because that's not even really the main way they make money. So this is just to say, when you hear these words that like the US is giving military aid, or the US is like helping folks militarily or with their defense strategy, that means that these companies are getting big payouts. They're cashing in. They're about to get huge orders of all of the weapons that they supply. Next slide, please. So it is estimated, right, that Israel has dropped 25,000 metric tons of bombs on Gaza just within the first few weeks of the attack in October. This is equal to the two nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II, right? Just in a few weeks. The carbon emissions of these bombings that we're talking about, they would equate to the annual energy use of about 2,300 homes, or the annual greenhouse gas emissions from about 4,600 vehicles. In addition, in order to even like operate, right, aside from these bombs, in order to even operate the aircrafts, the tanks, the fighter jets, the submarines, all of these weapons, large amounts of fossil fuels are needed, right? Mind you, militaries around the world aren't necessarily required to report their carbon emissions. So the amount of carbon emissions generated by the Israeli military, let alone like militarism globally, is quite literally unfathomable, right? So they have all of this, right? But even again, to operate these tanks, right? Fuel is needed for drones, for ships. Carbon emissions and toxins are generated by the making and exploding of bombs and rockets. So oftentimes for folks who are not who live in places where they don't have to experience bombings and explosives, quite frankly, very often, folks think that like a bomb drops and things kind of just like evaporate and disappear into the world. However, that's not what happens, right? Everything is made out of something. Everything is made out of raw materials, chemicals. When things are bombed, they don't just disappear, right? All of the raw materials that make up whatever it is that's getting bombed, whether it's buildings, think about the things in front of you, right? Like your chairs, your whatever. All of the chemicals that are used to make that now go into the air, right? Let alone when we talk about like the human cost, right? So that is another thing. Chemical warfare, right? Dr. Patrick brought up the use of white phosphorus, which is so powerful that it's known to burn human flesh to the bone. and is also capable of literally setting fields and structures on fire just from the use of this chemical. And then the buildup of phosphoric acid can also deplete soil fertility and increase erosion. So literally even the food sources are being poisoned by all of this destruction. Next slide, please. Settler colonialism, which is what Israel is, right? A settler colony state where a kind of a foreign population is brought in to replace the indigenous population, is in and of itself, right, creating a climate crisis. Like building Israel's iron wall, like the wall that they have on the border with Gaza, used almost the same amount of carbon emissions as whole countries, right? And during the first like days of the attack, Israel cut off and limited water, electricity, and fuel supplies to Gaza. Mind you, Gaza's water pumps run on electricity and fuel. So that means their sewage treatment facilities are not able to run, right, without this electricity. Without access to this infrastructure, right, with ongoing airstrikes, sewage from Gaza is literally flowing into the Mediterranean Sea, which brings me to my next point. Next slide, please. 97% of Gaza's water is unsuitable for human consumption, right? Polluted water is the source of 26% of all illnesses. This was before October 7th, let alone now, and is one of the leading causes of child death in Gaza. Waterborne diseases like typhoid, right? Cholera are all super common in Palestine. And the agricultural land depends on this water, right? And so then that land becomes contaminated and it devastates local crops and it destroys local cattle and people's food sources. Next slide, please. So all of that to say what? At Dissenters, we are trying to combat this by direct action and protest. That's what we are, a grassroots direct action-based org. We've been collaborating with the National Students for Justice in Palestine group, Palestinian Youth Movement, the USCPR, and other orgs to organize mass mobilizations and direct actions. So we primarily target military and weapons manufacturers. So I'll just give y'all kind of two examples to give y'all an idea of what we do and show y'all how y'all can support our students. So like I said, we primarily target weapons manufacturers, those guys that were making all that money off the genocide. At UMass, right, 57 of our students were just arrested at UMass for doing a sit-in in the chancellor's office. And their demands were for the chancellor to condemn the IDF and their attacks on Gaza and to cut the university's ties with Raytheon. So UMass has a huge contract, which they literally call a pipeline for students into Raytheon Technologies. The second thing I want to highlight is we have local crews. So also in November, we had a Stop the Bombs action in St. Louis where more than 75 protesters shut down a Boeing's weapon manufacturing that was making small diameter bombs that were going to be sent to Israel. And so we shut that factory down so they weren't able to make those bombs. Those are just two examples, but I have so many more examples that I would love to share with folks who want to chat at some point of the type of direct actions that we do to try to combat, right, the genocide that's going on right now. So I want to drop a couple of links so y'all can read about these stories. And I'll also drop a link so y'all can see our website. But that is essentially my presentation. I just wanted to say that direct action works. Folks, public opinion is changing. Folks are more and more on the side of Palestinian liberation, and also justice for all the innocent lives that are being lost in Gaza, that are being taken in Gaza and in Palestine at large. And that is because of us, the people that are mobilizing under Palestinian leadership to force, right, these power brokers to do what we know is right. And a big part of that is y'all being here and educating yourself. So honestly, kudos to y'all for that. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Angel. Like so much enraging information, but Dissenters is doing great work. And really appreciate you presenting all that. So now we'll pass to Tara, and another reminder to add questions to the Q&A box so we can get back to them at the end. Go ahead, Tara.
Thank you to the presenters who have shared all the knowledge that they have. Deeply appreciate all of your work and your effort to raise awareness around anti-war in Palestine. And thank you to the organizers for bringing us all together and making this webinar happen. It's pretty critical and important to see this from as many angles as possible. I'll say Buju Ginawa, Jabwekwe Indigenous Makwan Dudame Kuching Adunshaba. My name is Tara. I'm Bear Clan from Kuching First Nation Anishinaabe, calling you from Anishinaabe territory, from my homelands. And yeah, just grateful to be in space with all of you as we take a moment to step away from the onslaught of horror that I'm sure so many of us are seeing on our feeds every single day and have seen every single day for the last 109 days. But, to one of the points that I think was raised, this did not start on October 7th. This started many, many, many decades before that. 2023 was actually on track to be the deadliest year for Palestinian children before October 7th. So this is not something that came out of nowhere. And the anti-war movement in general, I think, is something that to another point that I saw in the comments. I feel like in movement, in talking with movement elders and folks who continue to resist into their 70s and their 80s, that there are ebbs and flows in our movement, and that we are really, really high for moments where it's, we're fighting like world banks in the 90s, and the efforts of land defense in the 80s, and then there's like an ebb again after that. It's like you almost crest, and then it wanes. And that means like the anti-nuclear movement that was really, really, really powerful in the 70s and continues with so many older activists and has been picked up by some. But I feel like this situation that the world has quickly become very aware of has exposed our need to really consider and think about the critical importance of the anti-war movement, and what our tactics are, what we can strategize about in this conversation of climate, right? Like climate is, I don't even use, people talk about intersectionality. I mean, to me, if we don't have a habitable planet to live, we don't get to resist anything anymore. We don't get to build a beautiful world if we can't live in the world. It is not a issue area. It is our literal habitat and our survival. And so in that way, it is connected to everything. It's connected to every aspect of our lives, every aspect of how we are able to continue as a species. So of course, it's connected to militarism. Of course, it is connected to the anti-war movement, to colonialism and imperialism that continues to plague the world. I mean, I look at this issue of militarism, and when I've spoken on this before, because I know that several of us hearing these really brilliant minds have worked on issues of anti-war before. This is not something new, but there is new eyes on it, and in this moment we seize that attention, I think, to achieve liberation for Palestinians, to achieve at least at a minimum the end of the onslaught of daily horror of children losing their lives every single day and being killed every single day. But I think the core of militarism, Indigenous peoples around the world have experienced militarism since the very beginning. I mean, militarism is colonialism, is imperialism, right? Like that is the theft of land, that is the active acquisition and theft of resources, but they're not resources to us, right? It's like our lives, our sacred places, our reality, but quantified down to resources, to precious minerals, to water, to land itself, right? There's so much always over the fight for land. And that to me is militarism, right? Like the continual expansion and the continual reach into the last places on earth that are still held by indigenous peoples, by peoples who have held onto those places for so many thousands of years. And I think that's where, at least for me as an indigenous person, I feel so deeply tied, having been to Israel, Palestine, having seen the people and the place and met with the, you know, Bedouins, and all of it is to see, you know, for me, our people, Anishinaabe people, once called, you know, the New Brunswick area home thousands of years ago. I would not show up to my Penobscot relatives today and tell them that their house didn't belong to them anymore. It's mine now. You know, that their water is, that I will systematically make sure that their water is unclean, that I will engage in a full-on military blockade of their food, of their health resources, of literally every last material good that human beings need to survive. It just harkens back to a time when our own people were under full military blockade, when we were put into POW camps, which are reservations, right? Like, that is the history and the reality of Native people, both in North America, South America, all over the world. I mean, that's what has occurred in so many ways and spaces. I'm not going to share, I mean, there's been so many statistics that have been shared that are brilliant, and I'll take the slides with, and I think all of us know at a core level that if you are dropping literally tens of thousands of tons of bombs on a place, that it's not just the actual immediate casualty and destruction that is rained upon those people in that territory and that land and that water. It is also the longstanding impacts afterwards, right? Like, I think about the Eastern Shoshone people. They are considered the most bombed nation on earth, who experienced, you know, the U.S. Military's continual nuclear testing for decades and decades, without permission, without consent, without even notification. And then everyone started dying of cancer, and everyone started getting brain tumors, and everyone started dying of all these different diseases. And that is still the case today. You know, it does not go away in a year or two, or when we flip to the next story, or the next massacre, or the next genocide, or the next awful thing that's going across our phones, because that's the state of the world. I mean, we're seeing what the world is when it's a world that is entirely based in extraction of land and of human beings, and of the most basic principles of life, which is that we are in a web of life. We are not on top of life. You know, those impacts will continue to be in place, and people will continue to experience them. I think about the folks that are going to be dealing with those impacts, and what that's going to look like when the bombs finally do stop, because they will stop. You know, that will happen. I know that it will happen. The speaker before me brought up direct action. That was, you know, that's something that's near and dear to my heart as a founder of a collective that is based in land defense, that is based in direct action, as a critical component of a healthy movement. You know, I don't think that we are achieving our ends in policy. I don't think that we are achieving our ends in parades anymore, or in marches. I think those are important moments of gathering together, of being together, of feeling that we are strong, that we are powerful, that we are not alone, because that is often the intention, is to make us feel like we are isolated and we are alone and we have no power. But I've found that that is entirely not true. 10 days after the full-on assault of Gaza began, I was locked to a piece of equipment down in the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Not just because of the destruction of the Mountain Valley Pipeline to that beautiful place in Appalachia, but because it's also directly tied to Elbit Systems. It's right upstream of them, and that's who they're going to be providing their fossil fuels to. It is all one giant complex. It's not very hard to make these connections between climate destruction and military. You know, the fossil fuel has to come from somewhere. The precious minerals have to come from somewhere. The water it takes to extract those things comes from somewhere, always. And then there's the testing of it, right? I mean, like those are, I think, you don't really have to think too hard when, we're being questioned. What is the connectivity between militarism and environment? I was on a board last night where the board was saying that it was inappropriate for us to make that connection. And I was like, are you kidding me? You're literally talking about one of the biggest emitters on the planet. I mean, that's nuts. We are the largest consumer of fossil fuels and like products and goods and whatever in the world. And like to not talk about that when that's over like what, 30% of the budget, 60% of the budget. I mean, it doesn't change if a Democrat or a Republican is sitting in office. It's always the same amount. So like those things are incredibly important. I'll wrap up and say the last piece, which is I do think that tax resistance is a very powerful form of resistance. I've heard that conversation percolating through many activist circles, and I think it's one that we really need to consider and explore. Whether we are comfortable with our tax dollars going to blowing up children and their families, relentlessly, with total impunity. I think that's a powerful form of resistance, and it seems like a more direct approach than just the marches. So I'll leave it with that. Miigwech.
Thanks so much, Tara. And thank you to all the panelists who I think can come back on video now. And we have a few questions to answer. Great, welcome back. Okay, Tara, when you're ready, welcome back. I'm just going to start with an opener question. Patrick, I think you sort of answered this in chat, but one person was asking kind of a definitional question that we can start with and then move on to a few others. So military emissions accounting doesn't include scope 3 emissions of new fossil fuel developments by the occupier. So you answered in the chat, but it's an interesting question. So maybe you could elaborate on it and also explain what scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are.
I reckon that there are plenty of people on this call that can probably define scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions better off the top of their head than I can. But scope 1 being kind of direct tailpipe emissions, scope 2 being from the kind of manufacturing processes that result in those things that burn fossil fuels, so like the manufacturing of the car, and then scope 3 are the like broader universe of emissions that make that manufacturing possible, so like commuting of employees, things like that. Or basically kind of the scopes broaden out into the activities that ultimately flow into whatever thing you're considering. And just say that there's so much we don't know about the emissions of the military industrial complex worldwide, and that's not an accident. The US specifically demanded a carve out for militaries during the negotiations of the Kyoto Protocol in '92, which of course the US then didn't sign, despite also mandating carbon trading internationally in that process. So really screwed up the entire international climate process for decades by those and several other actions. But we still just don't know. There's really poor reporting and we're on military emissions. It's generally voluntary. There's only 4 countries in the world that report military emissions to the UNFCCC. So everything that we know about military emissions basically is either self-reported, which there's very serious discrepancies in like US DoD reporting, or it's been done sort of reverse engineering it like we've done by using media reports or by using self-identified, self-reported data and then applying more realistic carbon costs to them. So there's a big kind of data justice movement around this. I don't particularly find that the most politically important question, but it's still an important question to get this data at our fingertips to understand the full scope of climate harms caused by the military, in addition to the catastrophic human impacts of waging war globally, or also just the way that militarism flows into kind of everyday American or North American society. what other folks have called the aesthetics of fascism, where the sort of iconography of war is omnipresent in our everyday lives and really poisons a lot of human connections.
Yeah, totally. Okay, thanks for that answer. And then this is a question I think for all panelists. Someone asked, how can we call in community members who maybe care about climate but are obtuse about the climate issues around Israel-Palestine, maybe oppose a ceasefire? And I would broaden that to just maybe people who care about climate justice but don't necessarily see military funding or militarism as a piece of the climate justice movement. And especially for Tara and Angel and the organizing work that you do, are there specific strategies that you find are particularly like effective and have been working at calling people into like thinking about the military industrial complex as like a key partner of other destructive industries?
I can get us started on an answer. I definitely think as far as like the organizing world, political education is key. I think there also is the question between people who want to, quite frankly, like people who want to be moved and people who like are coming to you in bad faith. So I think there's also some discernment around, maybe some of y'all community members, they might be down with the genocide. I don't know. So that's sometimes a hard pill to swallow. But for other folks, a lot of political education is needed. And I think another way that I've personally like learned from a lot of Palestinian organizers is like literally folks who are anti-imperialist, anti-war, inserting themselves in these climate spaces. I learned about the issue from Palestine doing like police brutality and like abolition work, right? And I think Palestinians have done an amazing job of making their issues salient in the abolitionist movement, repro justice movement, and the climate movement. Like Palestinians have been kind of over the last like 20 years, you can't even go on a major campus without seeing an SJP. So I think for those of us who do see the connections, I do think it's on us to like really insert that in all of these spaces, and in places it's not, like speaking up on it. And then for folks who like on a kind of like a one-on-one individual level, I think it really is like everybody kind of cares about different things, and different things can be used to connect things for folks. So, for example, for me, there have been folks in my community, which I mostly consider to be like the Black community, where I've had to draw parallels, right, on our experiences with Palestinians' experiences, or even making connections between the way that like toxic waste is usually put near poor Black communities. So I think depending on who you talk to, unfortunately, militarism is so big that you can damn near connect it to anything. So I think it's really a matter of like who you're talking to, what do they care about, and how does militarism kind of affect that thing? And then for those of us who know what militarism and climate change, how they go together, really inserting that in every movement space we're in. And I would love to hear, Tara, what you have to say.
Yeah, thanks for your wisdom. I'll speak to just like one piece, which is I think the very beginning when you were talking about like the people who come to you in bad faith and the people who come to you and actually genuinely want to learn, or people who are genuinely kind of like questioning what their own understanding is, right? Like I think you actually can discern that based on approaches people have, and how they come at you and the way they come at the questions around Palestine, around militarism, around all of it, right? Because like it's like, oh, well, are you therefore like not patriotic? Do you not believe in your nation? Are you like saying that we shouldn't be voting for Joe Biden? Like, and I'm like, yes, you should not. Like that's where I'm at, right? Like, which is like, I have a hard line rule when it comes to genocide. Like it's no. The answer is no. But I think like something I see reflective of the climate movement broadly, which is there is still a enormous amount of energy that is poured into base building, that is poured into the numbers versus like what are we doing with the people that are already here with us, right? And like how are we being effective with the energy that is already present? Because I think that there actually are quite a few folks who get it, right? Like 66% of voters are supportive of a ceasefire. Like, it's not like there's a very few number of folks who understand what's going on, who understand at a minimum that, you know, killing 12,000 children in like less than 3 months is like not okay, right? Like, that is a hard line, not okay. So for me, I think like there, yes, political education, outreach, constant, like, you know, trying to equate things in lots of different ways for different folks, getting them to see graphs. You know, I think like a lot of folks in the climate movement are drawn to numbers and graphs, and that's always helpful. But at the end of the day, I also think like there is a real need to be effective in the use of our energy and how we direct it, right? Like, how are we dealing with folks who are already here? You know, like, that's something I wish for the climate movement also.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Okay, we've had a couple questions about tax resistance, so I'm going to go ahead and read one out. There's been buzz around tax resistance as a strategy to defund or disrupt the US military. Curious if any of the speakers can speak to the relevance of tax resistance in this moment, if there's any historic precedents for connections between withholding taxes for military and climate purposes, and if not, maybe why this wouldn't be a helpful strategy. Does anyone have any thoughts on this as a strategy?
I can say super briefly that I think it's definitely a strategy and a tactic worth looking into. Part of the reason why myself and others co-founded Stop the Money Pipeline in the first place was because we understood that our moral arguments are not reaching folks, but our money does, right? Like, they actually really care about that. It is a incredibly effective strategy. It is a long-standing strategy, right? Like, you're not going to get instant results like that. But above all, I mean, look at what has happened in the span of the last few weeks with an attack on a trade route, right? Like, they don't care about millions and millions and millions of people marching. I mean, some people do, right? Like, some decision makers do. But in the span of what, a few hours, you had the UK saying ceasefire because there is like a disruption to trade, you know, like, they care about money. So I think I don't know. I think it's a very powerful strategy, personally.
If I can just follow on Tara real quick. I don't know, I'd be curious to see, you know, some more substantial proposals or ideas about how tax resistance can be effective and how widespread it would need to be to move the needle. I mean, I'm showing my age a little bit here, but I remember the tax resistors and anti-war movement, you know, showing up at anti-war demos in 2002, 2003. And it was always a bit of a fringe curiosity more than it seemed like a real active mode of resistance. But I do very much follow Tara's point that hitting them in the pocketbook is a really good way of getting folks' attention. And I think that's why, you know, at Climate and Community Project, where Batul and I work, a lot of our work is with workers, with organized labor and even with unorganized labor, and thinking about, you know, longshoremen and other like logistics workers who are capable of like gumming up global logistics systems. To me, that seems to be a real leverage point that we have, and you know, folks have done this, and it's been successful. And so I would say that organizing of that variety, in addition to the work that all of y'all do day in and day out, that works. That has a track record, that can get the goods. So yeah, tax resistance, by all means, explore it. And if it's something that you feel like it could be an effective tool in the toolkit, absolutely. But labor is where I would locate the primary sort of levers that our team can help pull.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I think that's also very much in line with the BDS movement, or boycott, divest, sanction movement, which is the Palestinian-led call, obviously, to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, not only to hit them in the pocketbook where it hurts, but also to denormalize apartheid systems and, you know, to call them out very clearly. And divest our spending from them in every way that we can and call on our institutions to do the same. So I know that's a lot of like campus activity is divesting from Israel, from stopping new campuses from being built in Tel Aviv and that kind of thing. We just have a little bit more time. So I wonder, maybe we can finish with a question about, next steps kind of for our movement. So the question is, can panelists talk a little bit more about what our movement can do? Assuming that's the climate justice movement. So we just discussed the tax strike. They mentioned pushing the military industrial corporations to manufacture electric buses instead of bombs, etc. What are you all seeing as sort of next steps from here to change, what we face right now? Angel, maybe you want to start us off and tell us a little bit about how Dissenters is kind of thinking about this moment.
Absolutely. So we've kind of been thinking about this moment. We've been seeing like a lot of mass mobilizations. And so we've been really wanting to, as an organization, like, first of all, create a container for folks to like actually organize. I think those folks who are here are likely already in organizations. If not, you should definitely join one. But I think definitely a part of it is, so we talked about like hitting them where it hurts in the pocket. So we have our Divest from Death campaign. I think broad-based coalitions are kind of the most important thing. So I mentioned earlier that Palestinians have really been laying the groundwork for this moment, right? Where we're seeing, I personally have never in my lifetime seen this many people supportive of Palestinians or Palestine. And Palestinians have really laid the groundwork over the last like 20 or so years for this moment. And there are Palestinian-led orgs, right, that have campaigns. How do you bring your movement to these campaigns, right? How can unions, or how can climate justice orgs, or how can repro orgs be a part of this, right? Mobilizing your members, but also things like this, really showing the direct lines between what's going on in Palestine and your issue. I think specifically when it comes to the climate movement, I'm always thinking about this book I read that the Red Nation put out about the Red Deal. And it really offers like, oh my God, phenomenal like critique of the Green New Deal and how it's basically like in ways supports like green militarism, and doesn't go deep enough to really think about resource extraction and like raw materials and also consumption in the global north. I think specifically for the climate movement, I think those are really strong connections that can be made. And I think that also can be done by really building coalition with like race or ethnicity based leftist orgs, right? So like Red Nation is a good one. I think they're like Black Alliance for Peace is a Black anti-war org. That talks a lot about AFRICOM, right? When we talk about these military bases and their carbon emissions, like these are all orgs that the climate movement can really, really get a lot of knowledge and experience from, and vice versa, right? How can these movements, right, learn from the climate movement, but also how can folks in the climate movement learn from these? So I think incorporating these things that we know are related to climate into folks' campaigns, like I saw a question about campus organizing, and that's something we've been talking a lot about with our students, about how to like reach out to your Black student union, reach out to your Latinx student union, and really like make sure these communities are in leadership, make sure folks are supportive so that when you go up to the university senate or when you occupy the chancellor's office, there's mad people there. You have a lot of people power, and so the demands are a lot stronger. So we are personally are like grassroots people power all the way. I don't necessarily believe that like the ruling class is going to come give us what we want if we don't literally force them to. So my answer is always like our next steps are how do we escalate? How do we build stronger coalition and relationships and escalate and incorporate what's going on in other folks kind of movement silos and incorporate it into our movement?
Thanks, Angel. Patrick, you want to go ahead?
Is the question like next steps?
Yeah, so
Thanks.
like what should the climate movement be taking up from here, given that so much in the world has changed and we're in a new moment? Like, what's next for the climate movement? What should we be thinking about?
I mean, I really admire and support all of y'all who work in orgs that have been reluctant, if not hostile, to making a statement on Palestine. And I think that that must be an incredibly challenging position to be in, but I hope that you'll continue to push for making a statement and making a commotion that this is absolutely a climate justice issue. And to do so is to, we really like this quote from Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, that said effectively Palestine is a test case for so-called surplus populations in an era of the climate crisis. And that if we don't draw the line here, then the line will never be drawn. And this points to the urgency of the situation. And it also reflects one of my, I don't know if I'd say frustrations, but one of the challenges that I see with the climate movement, both like the climate justice folks and even more so with like, climate normies, basically, just the very parochial siloed nature of thinking that we need, climate action or climate justice in one country. I think I said this in my talk earlier, but there's no climate justice in one country. It's an international project or it's nothing. And so one of the things that I recommend, this is also about how we just talk to folks. If you're organizing locally on fighting a dirty power plant or toxic waste siting or fighting for more public investment in the things that we need, think about the international dimensions and talk about the international dimensions of where those materials are coming from, how U.S. emissions are harming small island developing states to whom we contribute effectively nothing in the form of climate finance for adaptation or low carbon development, right? We are really fundamentally all connected. And that starts with talking about the climate justice aspects of Palestine and then starting to ask a broader question about what is the role of the US in perpetuating climate injustice around the world, and how does that relate to the struggles that we're facing locally? So, maybe this is a pretty banal point about, zooming from the local to the global, but I think just having those conversations about the internationalist dimensions of climate justice is an incredibly important conversation to be having with your comrades right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Back to the power of the one-on-one conversation. Tara, go ahead.
I think for this particular moment, it's reflective in so many different ways of what we have been up to for the last decade, which has been, I know that folks love reading zines, they love reading manifestos, they love reading, but we also have to do. And as people who are in the so-called United States or in the so-called global North, we are some of the most privileged organizers on earth. We are not shot openly like in other places on earth, right? Like when I sit in spaces with other human rights defenders and hear what's happening with big oil, with the military, with all of that, hearing of their comrades who are shot, who are in prison indefinitely, I'm not saying that those things don't happen here, but I'm saying that we are still some of the most privileged, but we are also some of the most surveilled, which is something I think a lot of the organizers are always really surprised to learn about. It's like, because the stronghold is so intense here that we are so surveilled. It makes things difficult in a lot of ways. But my point is, using and finding our bravery, our hearts, our morality that we all have, to stand strong and to actually get out there and do something, right? Like that is, I think, what the ask oftentimes is from oppressed and repressed peoples. Please stand with us. Please understand that we take these risks because this is our land. We love our land, and I would do anything for my land, but I've been arrested this many times, and like it starts to get to a point where it's getting worse and worse and worse. We've got homies that are still inside in Cop City, right? Like those things are very serious risks that people are taking for the benefit of all. So when you're thinking about Raytheon, and you're thinking about Elba, and you're thinking about all the like these real bad actors, please listen to these calls that are coming for standing in solidarity with folks. Please stand with unions who are taking these brave stances, right? And calling for a ceasefire as like some of the biggest unions in the United States. I mean, these are real moments where we can act, right? We can politically educate ourselves, but we also need to act. And we need to do it very, very, very quickly. I mean, these folks that are, I don't know, as we're having this conversation, you know what I mean? Like every hour, every minute, I think about that. And it's just, it cuts your heart. So please find action and follow the leadership of the folks who are asking you.
Thank you so much. I love that about stepping into bravery. I think that's something that we could all use hearing. Thank you all so much. Thanks for everyone who joined us tonight. That's a wrap. We dropped a bunch of resources in the chat, and I think they'll share a feedback survey after, we're back on email. So Lee, go ahead if you have anything else to add, but I think that's it for tonight. And thank you all so much in solidarity with everybody.
Thank you, Batul, for moderating. Thank you, and Tara and Patrick and Angel. I learned so much, and I'm sure that all the attendees learned a lot today. So I just thank you for your time and your energy and your dedication. And we will be saving the chat, which I'm going to do right now, so we can make sure to get all of these resources out to you all. Karina is also putting the evaluation link in the chat. So please open that up right now. Make sure it's on your computer. We would love to hear your feedback about this particular webinar, and we will be getting another evaluation together to send out to you to get your feedback about the whole series. And that's it for this webinar. Thank you all for being here, for your questions, for your openness. And we hope to continue this very important work with you all. Good night. Thank you so much.